start to fit together. Last term we had a session on the beautiful, and in many ways the sublime is often conflated with the beautiful. For instance, if we look at football, invariably the commentator will say that's a sublime pass. So it's a ball that is passed from one person to another person. There's nothing unlimited about it. They mean it's exceptionally beautiful. It's fine. Or there's invariably comes up in media this idea of sublime as some exceptional form of beauty or some exceptional form of perhaps terror, a sort of intensity of the beautiful. These are my words with the sublime: discord, magnitude, formlessness, suspension, immeasurability, displacement, rupture, infinity, presentation, pulsation, unlimited. So in his book on the analytical of the sublime, Kant says that the beautiful and the sublime agree in this, that they're both pleased in themselves. It's related to a kind of form of pleasure. But there are remarkable differences between the two. The beautiful in nature is connected with the form of the object, which consists of having definite boundaries. So the beautiful is an object of form, whereas the sublime, on the other hand, is found in the formless object. So this difference between form and formlessness distinguishes beautiful and I'm not going to just a minute. The beautiful seem to be regarded as a presentation of an indefinite concept of understanding. The sublime is of a concept of reason. Therefore, the satisfaction in one case is bounded with the representation of quality, on the other hand, quantity. So the sublime comes from an Old English word, which comes from it spans an opening above the opening, carrying the weight of the wall behind it, collapse of which would close the opening. The word sublime also has a hold and physical verbal meaning of causing a solid state to pass into vapor state and condense back into a solid state. Hence it came to mean elevation or exaltation, converting something into inferior into something of higher worth. So it's often connected with alchemy, base metals turned into gold, or sort of elevated and ecstatic sense of something above. Lime's an old French word, a boundary that confines. A limen is a threshold. We have the sublime in the sense of a limited opening by passing through of which one is transformed in an elevated movement. In the Dionysian context, one enters a higher state by means of dissolution of ethnic regulation and identity. So sublime, the beautiful keeps things in place, whereas the sublime both disorders and elevates at the same time, both brings about dissolution and then transformation to a higher state. And in Kant, who's the main philosopher in the enlightenment of the sublime, the object in itself can't be sublime. It's only the relationship between the perceiving subject in relationship to the intended object which finds something sublime. So it issues out of a subjective turn in philosophy. So in itself, an object, even such as a work of art, can't be sublime. It's only something which happens to the faculties of the subject. Indeed, in a way, you could say one of the background reasons for the theorization of the beautiful and the theorization of the sublime is that the sublime is a decentering of the subject, whereas the beautiful is a kind of fluttering, a weightlessness of the subject, but nevertheless a kind of centeredness because all the faculties move at the same time. Whereas, so it's in accord, whereas the sublime is out of discord. It's the relationship between imagination and reason or understanding isn't stable. The imagination can't take in or can't quite find a relationship to what is infinite or immeasurable, and it causes displeasure. So it's a descent of the of understanding, which descent into the understanding, which can come up with the concept, let's say, of infinity. With the concept of infinity, feel the superiority, the moral law within. So for Kant, the idea of the sublime was related to the moral rectitude of the subject. So it had his epitaph was the moral law within and the starry night above. This is Gerhard Richter Betty from 77, but kind of gives this feeling of subjective intensity, which is related to sublimity. To put it paradoxically, the sublime would be an experience of what lies beyond experience. You could say what lies beyond experience is ecstatic. Ecstatic takes you out of yourself, points outside of the boundary of the self, is beyond. The sublime is experience in feeling rather than perceptual access to what is beyond. So it's a sensation followed by an ascent of reason to stabilize so it's a combination of pleasure and displeasure leading into pleasure. The first writings on the sublime is Longinus. For our soul is raised out of nature only through the truly sublime, sways with high spirits, and is filled with proud joy, as itself had created what it hears. So this kind of idea of elevation. So let's go back to the ball in football. The sublime is an elevated execution of something. So it finds a common usage in popular culture to do with that which is elevated. The century of the sublime was really the 18th century, and the Grand Tour was undertaken as an opening to the sublime experience, both in terms of crossing the Alps, but also discovering the fragmentary ruins of ancient world. Artists such as Salvador Rossi embodied the taste for this sublime aesthetic experience. So he's one of the Salvador Rossi was one of the highest paid artists of that period. And that you find them in a lot of English country homes. It's painted by Rossi. So you get this combination of the first philosopher of the sublime in the Enlightenment was really Burke, the Irish philosopher, and he saw it as a combination of terror and beauty. So often this threat of nature, this overwhelming force of nature, almost crushing human beings in the midst of. So he characterized nature as having forms and forces and colors. So he was very prescriptive about what the sublime was. So often the sublime was connected to the events associated with death or disaster. The extreme emotion that is generated this gave rise to a terror at the limit of depiction or a sense of rupture within continuity. Thus, the sublime could be understood as trembling on the edge of the limit. So this is how things are schematized, how things are brought, how things are ultimately named, and that those forces which escape being named gives rise to terror because they can't be controlled by the mind. So the sublime had a contradictory set of emotional reflexes connected with it. This is Pusan, landscape with a man killed by a snake. So here you can see first of all, the woman at the center who looks towards the man who gestures across at her figure in the ground, who's been just crushed by a snake or bitten by a snake, killed by a snake. So you get this internal triangulation of an event, a shock, kind of electricity passing through a landscape, a classical landscape, but a kind of interruption of that serene timelessness by an event of death. But it's displaced. It's a kind of indirect emotion. You don't see you're alerted to it. You get there's emotion which trembles through the painting, erupts through the painting. And there's a sort of feeling that the light is reversed. You get the light at the depths, and in the beginning you get the shadow. So the kind of reversal of the illumination. This is Burke, his book on the sublime and the beautiful. So Edmund Burke published his second philosophical essay in 1757. Kant followed in 1790, his book on critique of judgment, a philosophical inquiry into the origins of all our origin of our ideas on the sublime and beautiful. His central discussion is the enjoyment of beauty develops out of the way the imagination is engaged with obscurity as opposed to intellectual clarity, whereas with respect to the sublime, by a pleasurable form of terror and ignorance. So in many ways, the origins of aesthetics came out of, on one side, Germany, almost an idea of the fault line of reason or the blindness of reason to the effective encounter with nature or the relationship between the intended object and the perceiving subject, kind of a different way of trying to understand the subjective turn in philosophy and the fault lines of reason. This is Lyotard in his analysis of the sublime effect. Burke termed horror the state of mind of a person whose participation in speech is threatened. The power which exceeds the capacity of the interlocution resembles the night. We get this kind of contrast between light and darkness, and the sublime often mobilizes this kind of peculiarity of light, it's extreme light effects, which later on almost becomes a kind of form of installation art. So this is Immanuel Kant, who wrote the Critique of Judgment in 1790. He wrote 3 critiques in all. This third critique is the Critique of Judgment. So Kant accounts for different perceptions of what is sublime, different judgments from the vantage point of objects that may inspire the feeling of sublimity in terms of the subject's deference to the moral law. To feel the sublime, and not merely terror, we must be susceptible to certain ideas. We only feel sublimity insofar as our reason exercises a dominion over our sensibility, letting it look beyond itself into the infinite, which is, for it is also an abyss. So this relationship between abyss and finitude is the imagination sinks into an abyss and ascends towards infinity through reason. So it's the discord of imagination and reason that, or understanding, that Kant predicates his idea of the sublime on. For this reason, Kant says only the individual has developed moral laws will experience the sublime. The untutored will merely experience terror. So he kind of elevates the sublimity into beyond the idea of terror and beautiful, which is found in Burke, and the predication of the sublime in terms of colors and forms and atmospheres and moods. So in Kant, the stormy ocean isn't in itself sublime. It's only the perceiving subject in relationship to this stormy object, the feeling magnitude or feeling extent of something. And he divided the sublime into two manifestations: the mathematical sublime, which is extent and related to infinity, and the dynamical, which is related to force. So extent and force, mathematical and dynamical. The mathematical expresses extent and the dynamical forces. So he divided beauty into two forms: the free beauty and dependent beauty. Just as he divided imagination into two forms. Whereas the beautiful is limited, the sublime is limitless, so that the mind in the presence of the sublime, attempting to imagine what it cannot, has a pain in the failure, but pleasure in contemplating the immensity of the attempt. So again, this emphasizes the moral dimension of the sublime. So he says the sublime in the strictest sense cannot be contained in any essential form, but only refers to the ideas of reason. If the sublime is that which is absolutely great, it cannot be the property of the senses, because the imagination would be unable to synthesize the essential manifold. Therefore, there are no sublime objects, but rather sublime states of subjectivity. Thought are derived from encounters with certain types of objects. With the mathematical sublime, there is a presentation of the idea of infinity, which defies sensory experience. Imagination does not allow us to think totality, but we're able to think of infinity, which requires the faculty of the mind that is in itself supersensible. So the mind contains this capacity of supersensible calculation, as it were. Imagination both appears to lack the grasp of the formless object and yet grasp it at the same time. And for this reason, there is not disharmony between imagination and understanding. The dynamical sublime differs in that it contains the moment of anxiety or fear in the face of the possibility of being undone by the force of nature. This manifests as intense displeasure because of the vulnerability we experience, and yet this experience in itself does not qualify as sublime. Rather, is a movement of this displeasure being overcome by the process of reflection in which the resistance is achieved, and with it, the discovery of human freedom is not subject to moral natural destruction. So the sublime is also resistance to the extremes of nature. It was the idea, ultimately of being able to control nature's forces through the supersensible. This is Hegel. The sublime in art is an attempt to express the infinite without finding the realm and phenomena of any objects which proves itself fitting for this representation. Hegel, last week I read a little passage this is from 1805, just after the university town of Jena. And he talked about the way in which the daylight is negated into the night, into the darkness. And he says the image is unconscious, i.e. it is not displayed as an object for representation. The human being is this night, this empty nothing which contains everything in its simplicity, a wealth of infinitely many representations, images, none of which care to it directly and none of it which are present. This is the night, the interior of the human nature existing here, pure self, and in phantasmagoric representations is the night elsewhere. Here a bloody hedge suddenly shoots up, and there another white shape, only to disappear as suddenly. We see this night when we look at the human beings in the eye, looking into a night which turns terrifying. For from his eyes, the might of the world hangs out towards us. So he kind of had not just the idea of the unconscious, a kind of storehouse of images, which are not processed to be in the world. They kind of linger in this unhabituated space, this inwardness of the self, but they're born out of negation, and the negation is a kind of form of terror. And he talked about the subject being formed at the dissolution of its confrontation with death. So it's only in confronting dissolution that it finds itself. So it ascends itself out of the process of dissolution. And this is a kind of form of sublimity for Hegel. He doesn't quite call it sublimity, but it's related to the power of the negative. And he calls the night, and the place for the images in the night, in the unconscious, and it's stored in the spirits. He calls it spirit's treasury, which is a kind of pre-psychoanalytical way of understanding the unconscious. So it's in this period, this turn of the century, that the idea of the unconscious is born with idealist philosophy of, on the one side Hegel, on the other side Schelling. This is where Freud got his ideas from. It's again 18th century, mid-18th century, Joseph Wright of Derby, an experiment. So this is a moment between life and death. If the experiment works, the bird will live. If the experiment fails, the bird will die. So we get the sort of wonders of nature and the wonders of science being put together into a rudimentary experiment. It's very much based on the work of Caravaggio. And this, again, this extreme of shadow and light is one of the things where the sublime occasioned itself in terms of the visual arts. So the idea of scientific knowledge and with it the classification of nature went hand in hand. The world was in part abstracted into a series of machine-like parts that were subject to human powers of calculation. The discourse of the sublime acted in ways that stressed the unconscious in nature, and with this ethical respect of nature's capacity to beguile. So it's both the impulse to control nature, but also find release in nature, kind of capacity to beguile is in a way the sublimity. So sublimity went hand in hand with the respect for science and the respect for control. It was a kind of point at which there was a kind of losing an ascendancy, let's say. This is a painter, John Martin, who you can see in the Tate Gallery, Tate London, Tate Britain. He did these giant landscape paintings of mythical proportions, and And he painted mythical scenes and biblical scenes that opened out overwhelming images of ruination, apocalypse, and release of natural forces. As images, they are excessive in their exaggeration. They exerted great influence on early cinemas in place of the epic encounter. So, in a way, as a painter, he was much more influential a century later in terms of the birth of epic cinema. This is a representation of the parting of the waves in Genesis. The sublime does not prepare us for anything, and nothing prepares us for the sublime. So this undoing of calculation. So although the Enlightenment is a prelude to calculation, the whole world becoming a giant mechanical object in which all the parts and the wholes work together, and that the world is open to all objects of the world are understandable if submitted to deductive reason. Sublime is that which evades that calculation, or that power of calculation. This is Caspar David Friedrich, Monk by the Sea. This comes after the first wave of Romanticism. First wave of Romanticism is German Romanticism, which lasts for about 3 or 4 years at the end of the 18th century. Figures such as Novalis, Hölderlin, Schlegel brothers, Schelling and Hegel were all involved in the town of Jena. It's one of the greatest confluences of intellectuals ever assembled within Europe in this period. It could be seen as a counter Enlightenment. So Caspar David Friedrich was painting after that first wave. So again, it's a kind of double infinity. It's the monk isolated against an endless horizon of the sea. But as we step outside, we also see another figure of infinity. So it's a double infinity. So it's a painting which is in Berlin. This is Jean-Luc Nancy, who wrote one of the great essays, The Sublime Offering. The sublime is a feeling, and yet more than a feeling in the banal sense. It is a motion of the subject at the limit. The subject of the sublime, if there is one, is the subject who is moved. So this sense of, he understands exactly the Kantian imperative that it happens within the subject. Something happens within the subject which is sublime. So beyond being just a discord of imagination and reason, or imagination and understanding, it's the subject who is moved, the emotion of the subject at the limit. Wander above the sea of fog, this 1818. Again, non-sea. The sublime offering is at the limit of presentation and takes place on and along this limit, along the contour of form. So non-sea's proposition about aesthetic feeling is that it's a case of, is issued from presentation, not representation. Presentation is Darstellung, the journey of becoming. Vorstellung, representation, is a kind of, is predicated on a stable subject and is mimetic and is a grid-like structure. So it relates to stable sense of being. So sublime is related to presentation. It's a state of becoming, a state of endless realization, never being fixed by a stable identity. It's the coming apart of stable identity. It's Caspar David Friedrich. And he goes on to say what is at stake in the sublime is the suspension of art, the placing in question within art itself as a work or as a task. So this sense of it doesn't, it's not really a stable form. Something gets suspended and the question arises. So in his essay, The Sublime Offering, he says that the sublime is in fashion in the late modern period. It's in fashion because the modernity itself is suspended by the question of art. Can art continue? Are we approaching the end of art? Is mass culture a dissolution of art itself? Just stepping back from Friedrich into Turner. So Turner painted both historical events such as the slave ship in the mid-19th century or the flight in Temeraire, but also mythic episodes such as in Ulysses deriding Polyphemus. The sea represented great forces, either majesty or terror, one moment dire, the next moment radiant. The sublime could, in alternating waves, stage intensification, shock, and excess. Romanticism presented a counter-enlightenment, opposing the idea of nature should become an object of calculative control. So this is Fighting Temeraire, which is in the National Gallery. This is his famous painting, The Slave Ship. So again, this kind of excess of death and dissolution and a tinge with the beautiful. So it's this sort of contrast of extremes, of excess. So this painting was seen as a great advocate for the ending of slavery. The painting of Ulysses. So as if the same sunset is casting itself within the mythic ancient world or the modern world, industrial world, or the transition between the age of boats, of sailing ships, and power, coal-driven ships, steam. In 1924, Paul Elroy, the poet, and his wife Gala, who later married Salvador Dali, and Max Ernst set out on a voyage to Indochina as a means of consuming their ménage à trois, which disintegrated after their arrival. Ernst then visited the ruins of Angkor Wat, and it was to use this experience to record a world of savagery, annihilation, and fantastic otherness. These paintings recorded a sense of the world in which the human subject is marked by its absence. So he's really taken by this world he found in Angkor Wat of being these huge monuments being overrun by jungle, kind of feeling of a great civilization which had buried itself and become lost in the jungle, being erased from history. This is Max Ernst, Europe After the Rain, from 1942. So they very much used it as a kind of sense of what would happen to Europe in the Second World War. It's also an opening out onto the fantastical in nature. takes us to the abstract sublime. Zermatt Roscoe, Red on Maroon from 59. Again, they were Barnett Newman, Roscoe, very much connected by this idea of the abstract sublime, and they're much more influenced by Burke than Kant. And in Burke, there's a kind of prescription or predication of sublimity with certain colors and certain lack of form. So kind of intensification of color, kind of morbid color, let's say. Bart Newman is painting Via Heroicus Sublimus from 50 to 51. Bart Newman tried to do paintings which were so big that they would immerse the viewer from whatever position they were in the gallery. So he tried to literalize the feeling of sublimity. In a way, I always think these paintings are beautiful rather than sublime. They misrecognize sublimity as something that could be physically embodied. And this obvious sort of relationship to also Jewish mysticism and the kind of the zip as a kind of ontological opening of the light. There's Clifford Still, some certain title from 1950. So this kind of these immense canvases with either zips in or eruptions of color within a field of color. This also gave rise to monochrome. This is an exhibition of Ad Reinhardt, and they look as if they're just purely black paintings, but on closer inspection they have color radiates from within the black. So you get reds and blues and describing a geometrical order, but within a sort of embossed black glaze. And Reinhardt produced a whole series of black paintings which presented the notion of the infinite. He was influenced by Chinese classical monochrome paintings. He called these works his last paintings. So this kind of idea of the end of art and the idea of the last works. So not only do we get in early romanticism the idea of death being an attendant figure within the landscape of the sublime, we get the idea of the end of art. Indeed, increasingly the idea of the end of history, the last paintings, the death of painting, the procession of painting towards the end, the finality of painting. Here's Yves Klein. He traveled to New York and saw Rauschenberg's all white paintings. And he came back and developed a series of monochrome works in blue, which he called Yves Klein Blue. He also developed a series of performative works, such as The Leap into the Void. He said these paintings were an open window to freedom, as a possibility of being immersed in the immeasurable existence of color. So again, a sort of literalization of the idea of sublimity, the idea of the void and the vacuum, and this is a leap into the void, into the abyss. He staged this. He had mattresses on the floor. But in those days, seeing was believing. We understand its special effects now, but then wasn't understood like this, so it's seen as a kind of combining a kind of absolute freedom to, as it were, almost fly into the void, but also risk mortal damage to the body. And in the 60s and 70s, we start to get a literalization of the sublime. This is Walter de Mira's The Lightning Field, which is still there. I think you can see it. There's a sort of months in the year where you can see these witnesses. So yeah, as I introduced the possibility of immense spatial encounter, which made literal the vistas, which the pictorial position only alluded to. Through intervening directly into the forces and structure of nature, the appeal of this art was to exhibit sensations based upon material intervention. This is Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty. So although he didn't really talk so much about the sublime, it was obvious that he was inspired by ideas to do with formlessness and or form giving way to formlessness. So it's a kind of exercise in finitude. So Salt Lake eating up the structure was reconfigured later. At the same time, in the late 60s, we have what I would term the psychedelic sublime, and afterwards I'll play some of the music of, this is Pink Floyd, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. So as if there was a kind of conjoining of availability of LSD and the idea of a trip with space exploration and this idea of almost heavy metal sound and the idea of being a space cadet, kind of all linked to this kind of this construction of a psychedelic sublimity. This is Rolling Stones, 2000 Light Years from Home. And this is Jimi Hendrix setting fire to his guitar with lighter fuel. So evoking a kind of Dionysian excess, a kind of part of the wild side, the untamed, the uninhibited. So it had this kind of psychedelic sublime, had this relationship to violence and to excess and to extreme soundscapes and a sort of theatrical relationship to the outside, to the infinity. So it opened out the relationship to cosmology, to exotic cultures, and to forces of violence in a way it combined both forms of the sublime, mathematical and dynamical. It was in many ways a rebellion against the idea of mass culture, that mass culture was one-dimensional, grey in tone. This is an image from Apocalypse Now, the opening scene, which starts with the doors, the end. So it's both about the Vietnam War, the Indochina War. It's partly meant to be going out the Mekong towards Cambodia. But it's the end of civilization. It's the staging of a kind of mutation between forces of violence and sublimity. So the film Apocalypse Now splices together a fictional account with the war in Indochina, with the rock soundscape and the journey into the interiority of the subject. The Doors song, The End, opens the film, in which different elements are montaged together in order to provide a setting for the film. So the film, which employed psychedelic music, but also kind of a sense of where, in a sense, the subject comes undone. It's either by violence or drugs or by madness. So it finishes up with Marlon Brando reading a section from The Wasteland and extolling the edge of this disintegration of the subject, saying the horror, the horror, the horror. This is Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote a great exposition of Kant's Critique of Judgment. So he writes, the sublime feeling is not a mere pleasure as taste is, it is a mixture of pleasure and pain, confronting the objects which are too big according to their magnitude or too violent according to their power. The mind experiences its own limitations. So there's a different inflection in Kant. It is almost opposite, whilst staying close to the same schema. He says the sublime is a sudden blazing and without a future. So this without a future adds a temporal dimension to the sublimity, the idea of sublimity, but the idea of the end of art or the end of civilization or the end of culture is very much at the forefront of such a perception. And we get the repetition of forms. We get Richter doing these landscape paintings after a figure like Caspar David Friedrich that's stripped bare of theological connotation. So whereas Friedrich almost saw space as deity, in Richter it's bereft of that feeling. Painting of a seascape. This is Nancy again, who died just last year. History is a succession of ruptures of history, where this identification plunges back upon itself, and decision reoccurs. I like this idea of it impacting upon the actual materiality of history itself and seeing a succession of ruptures. This is very much in accord with our time. And he says, for Nancy, art itself, he quotes, art itself is deranged, and the sublime is what is central or at stake in this. What is at stake in the sublime is the suspension of art. A way of understanding this notion runs through the ideas provoked by something other than art, and thus the sense of suspension trembles on its own edge. Nancy notes that what is the issue of the work of art is not the relationship to truth as representation, but rather the presentation of freedom. So this difference between Vorstellung, the root of Stellen is a stand. So representation is stand before, but presentation is a journey. It's a process. So therefore it can present freedom, the becoming of something else, not a fixed condition. So freedom isn't something which is given to you by someone else, but is an eruption within inside the subject. Nancy also claims the sublime is rather unaesthetic and is closer to ethics than the and that the sublime, rather than being subordinate to the beautiful, transforms and transfigures it. The sublime is figured as an aesthetic movement as opposed to an aesthetic of movement as opposed to aesthetic of static. So we've got this contrast in Kant between the objective form and the formless object as being the difference between the beautiful and the sublime. But we also here in Nancy got the idea of the aesthetics of movement as opposed to aesthetics of static. So beautiful is static. And as such, escape from limitation, state where everything becomes small. Placed at the limit, there is no longer either a figure or figuration or form. Instead, we're given over to a pulsation. So not just a movement, but a pulse. Onansis sublime does not escape to a space beyond the limit. It remains at the limit and takes place there. So the limit of presentation is what is occasioned by the sublime. This is Hiroshi Sugimoto, Agent C, from 1990. Cornelia Parker took a shed and had it exploded by the army and reconfigured the remains of the explosion in terms of this form, which is both a light projection and a reconfiguration of fragments. So it presents the transition between an object form and the condition of formlessness, mediated by the violence of the instant, thus suspending this transition as an arrest of becoming other. It's a painter called Jonathan Waterbridge, jungle scene with a plane wreck. It's again closer to the cinematic than to history of painting. Could almost be the opening of a film set.
Oh, I can understand that, yeah. And it's just awkward because it's like he didn't choose to give me money, he chose to give an art student the money, and we have to show our work. I find that really awkward. Yeah. And he's like an old rich man that I have lots of.
So they record a world on the edge of disintegration as if the forces of nature are in the process of consuming the technological world. Ruination was also always a feature of the sublime imagination, but here it is also linked to abjection. The influence of cinema is self-evident in the way the painting seems to stage the image. This is it's like LA curious image of a woman inscribing something into his back, as if the scene itself is somehow becoming a spectacle apart from human interaction. I was thinking a little bit about the special effects and depictions of vast spaces of history and science fiction, as well as political or war-based subjects you find in the cinema of Ridley Scott, was a student at the Royal College. They include Alien, Blade Runner, Gladiator, Kingdom of Heaven, and American Gangster. His cinema reflects both the ideas related to both modes of the sublime. We could say that the cinema in the 20th century has been the one that's closest to enacting ideas of sublimity. This is a film, Blade Runner, which in a way was seen as a classical postmodern film in which human indexicality is brought into question by replicants who whose memories are very close to that of human, but they don't even know they don't know what they are. Descartes, who in the himself is a replicant, asks how can they not know who they are or what they are, and so he falls in love with the replicant, but we don't know what's implanted emotion, what's real emotion, or whether or not the real emotion is possible. These are drawings by Robert Longo, the new image artist, New York artist. And a lot of those artists like Robert Longo and Jack Goldstein were influenced by cinematic scale, the 70mm projections and walls of sound in music. So they enacted this sort of massive scale of the abstract expressionist, but with reference to the cinematic scale. So there's something of the literalness of the image, something of where the literalness becomes a frozenness of the image, a suspension of the image, a kind of cataclysmic forces becoming an image, as it were, fixed by the image. So a kind of paradox of representing these great, what we call hyper objects like nuclear explosions, and as a kind of shorthand for the sublime. So as if you can restage Géricault's paintings of the Rafter Medusa in terms of a late modern context. The painting of a shark. Again, very cinematic in the way it occasions itself or presents itself. And we wonder, with such works, whether it's sort of bordering on not just a literal embodiment of sublimity, but a kind of kitsch version of it. Which is a fault which runs through the cinematic embodiment of sublimity. This is Jack Goldstein. So it's in the 80s, this kind of idea of new image art, and this idea of the image spectacular and simulation. Baudrillard was very fashionable in New York at this time. His writings on simulation and spectacular image kind of coincided also with an older fascination for Sight of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. This is Jack Goldstein, painted by Jack Goldstein. He died of a drugs overdose. This is from Vertigo Sea, who develops narratives related to the Atlantic Ocean, images related to the slave trade, whaling migration, and Walras creates a rich tapestry of historical trauma and sublimity. This is a still from Vertigo C, which is a triple screen presentation. The mixture of imagery, some drawn from the archive of the BBC for nature programs, some of it drawn from historical images of the slave trade, some of it from whaling imagery. It evokes in Moby Dick and images of migration in boats. So it's both documentary images, but also constructed images. There's a confluence and a constellation of those images. This is Esther Teichmann. It's a work called Untitled from Mythologies in 2012. But she does paintings of swamps and caves, and they very much, there's a kind of sense of return to early Romanticism. You very easily write a commentary to do with Schelling's view of the unconscious in nature, or Hegel's Night of the Subject, or the image is unconscious. So they're both photographic images and also stained in colors. The journeys into swamps, caves, darkened interiors, these are shadowy regions. A feeling of abandonment infiltrates the restricted economy of light. A lot of the recent commentaries upon the sublime is that his technology, the source of the sublimity now, rather than nature. This is particularly in the case of Gilbert Rove. So he says technology has assumed the idea of the sublime because whether to a greater or an equal extent than nature is terrifying in the limitless and knowability of its potential, while being entirely a product of knowledge, combines limitless with pure ratio, and thus is unbounded by the human, and as knowledge a trace of the human now out of the latter's control. One of the most popular installations in modern Tate Modern, Eliasson's Weather Report, which kind of literalizes the sublime. It stimulates the presentation of what might imagine as a starting point for a sublime experience, but one bereft of any danger. There is instead a warm glow of technological otherness that induces contemplation instead of discord. I call it health and safety sublime, health and safety sublimity. We get into the work of James Turrell, these spaces in which the boundaries are dissolved, the sensation of dissolution into color presents a dematerialization of the world. I once went into a Turrell installation, went into this all black room, and you didn't have the feeling of any walls there. Quite a lot of people leant backwards as if there was a wall and fell over. But after being in the room for about 10 minutes, you began to have this sensation of light in the retina, and you didn't know whether you were seeing light from within the brain or whether or not there was light on the outside. And there was these very low, almost black light, but a light form which could, when the eye relaxed long enough, it could pick up the perception, but you didn't know the difference between inside and outside. Very strange sensation. So again, the sublime is an undoing of perceptual certainty. It's a James Turrell installation. So he kind of literalizes the sensation of the monk by the sea of Friedrich. So Anish Kapoor's Marsyas. So the titles comes from Titian's painting from 1570 called The Flaying of Marsyas. So it alludes to this, but again, produces a spectacle, a kind of mass. It was staged as the largest single sculptural installation ever to occur within a contemporary space. As if the body of Marsyas is this figure without skin is emblemized in the sculptural form. There is a sense that the flayed body is being stretched out to its limit, but without the feeling of limit contained within Titian's painting. Photographed by Andreas Gursky. So again, we get this feeling of a collision between human world and technological world, and kind of sense of post-history or post-human. So you get this vastness of scale, saturations of light, vistas of spatial dissolution, all provide the spectator with a spectacle of being within the sublime experience, but without either fear or danger, as if the language of striation has been removed in advance by health and safety. Doris Salcedo. So the Tate, again, another installation. I must say, much more subtle than the ones which we've preceded it. So it might be seen as a pure image of discord. One whose threat has been understated. The feeling of apprehension emerges from within the play of absence and presence set between mind and matter. So a kind of much more subtle working of the idea between material form and mental effect. Yaya Kusuma. This is Fireflies on the Water. A kind of infinite room of infinite effects, dizzying, overwhelming. Networks of lines, emergence and dissolution of grids, infinity, pulsation of matter, striations, diagrammatic encounters, and the folding of deep space. Instead of objects inscribed in space, we become subject to another form of distribution which touches upon the realm of the hyperobject. Painted by called Dispersion, Julia Merito. So hyperobjects is a term introduced by Timothy Morton as a way of describing the phenomena such as global warming or radioactive plutonium that transcends localization, so it's non-local, and instead massively distributed in time and space. In that hyperobjects can be said to exceed the grasp of our imagination capacity, there is a replication of sublime formlessness beyond representation. I wonder if this realm of the hyperobject replaces this as sublimity, or is the equivalent of what, as to the late 18th century, what is in terms of its distribution of time and space in new ways, whether the hyperobject replaces the idea of the sublime in the late or the early 21st century. This is a work by Julian Bell, painting. Painting was based upon a scene witnessed in the desert, Karakum Desert, after it was drilled and set alight by Soviet engineers who decided to burn off the gas inside, but had left it to burn after losing control of the situation. The strategy of this book, so it's to do with hyperobjects, is then to awaken us from the dream that the world is about to end, because the action on the earth, the real earth, depends upon it. The end of the world has already occurred. We can be uncannily precise about the date in which the world ended. Convenience is not readily associated with historiography, nor indeed with geological time, but in the case it was uncannily clear. It was on April 1784 when James Watt patented the steam engine, and an act that commenced with the depositing of carbon on the Earth's crust, namely the inception of humanity as a geophysical force on a planetary scale. So this date of 1784 corresponds to the time when Kant was writing his Analytical Sublime in 1790. It's a painting by Mark Bradford, LA painter. Massive. It was in Hauser and Wirth. Again, this idea of the cinematic scale, the 70 millimeter film projection. That's Cerberus is a creature of Greek mythology who guards the gates of Hades, thus preventing the dead from leaving. So this kind of feeling of urban detritus connected with Greek reference to myth and to Hades and guarding Hades. So a kind of a folded over of the contemporary and the ancient. So this is finite thinking by Nancy, in which the essay The Sublime Offering is printed. One of the great essays, contemporary essays on the subject. Another reference to the sublime objective ideology by Zizek. Zizek triangulates the relationship between the Kantian sublime, the dream work in Freud, and value in Marx. And he comes to the conclusion that there's no reality to there's no, not reality, but there's no meaning to dreams. They can't be, there's nothing that you can't find a truthful narrative within dreams. No truth effect, no indexical relationship to the real. And just as he talks about Marx, he says that there's no true value within value. That, in a way, value goes right back to Aristotle, where there was a kind of sense of indexicality to value, and that seeing was believing. He said that of all the senses, in his metaphysics, he said of all the senses that which is truest is that which is witnessed by sight. So indeed, in a certain way, seeing became believing. And in the late modern period, then we removed all sense, that all images are subject to manipulation or simulation. That's one of his most interesting books, but it's also connected with the idea of the end of time, which has got the image of the Friedrich painting. So you get these falls between the early stages of Romanticism and late modern or postmodern or contemporary theories of the hyper object or the sublime objective ideology, or living in the end of times. These are just some more book references. A little fast portrait of psychedelic sublimity. Questions, thoughts. Better put my screen on. Didn't realize it was on.
It's a lot to take in there, Jonathan, all in one go. So everybody's in stunned subliminal silence, I think.
A basic thesis running through it, which is the difference between a kind of literal prescriptive idea of the sublime, which comes from Burke, and the more philosophically nuanced embodiment in Kant, and the way that the sublime kind of tends to go from one extreme to the other, and becomes a prescribed look, which ignores the fact that in a way the sublime can't be a work of art. And then the refuge in the sublime in mass culture, rock music and cinema. And then the appearance of the idea of the hyper object. So kind of return to Romanticism, but within the context of the ending of the world or the dissolution of the world. If I had to summarize, I'd say that was the summary.
I have a question, if I may. Hi, Jonathan.
We can, yeah.
Well, my understanding from your lecture is that the sublime and the examples that you showed, that the sublime is drawn from destruction and from pain. Whilst prior to coming to the lecture, I actually expected and thought, wrongly or rightly, I don't know, that the sublime could be born as well from extreme happiness and perhaps religion, spirituality, but not necessarily out of fear, out of desire as well.
Sublime is always comes out of discord, displeasure combined with pleasure, or beauty and terror, or I mean, there's different varieties of. I mean, in popular culture, the sublime is excessively beautiful gesture, or it pertains to form. So we say, "Oh, that's sublime," and it's just a figure of speech. It doesn't necessarily follow what's been said about the sublime. So we've got the sublime figure, which is philosophically marked, and we've got sublime within mass culture, which is not not dependent upon any philosophical reading. So as artists, we either have to go with the discord of the sublime, or we have to go with the popular feeling of the sublime, and we get pulled and pushed either way. So I wouldn't say Eliasson's weather report work in the Tate was sublime. It's beautiful, painted by some of the paintings which looked at as sublime are beautiful paintings, not sublime paintings. So it's a matter of your reading of the sublime. It's been literalized as if by making something massive and monumental, that's already a feature of the sublime. So I would say a lot of the Tate installations aren't really sublime, but they have all the rhetoric and noise of sublimity. So it's a special effects sublime.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love the notion of the health and safety sublime. I think that's a perfect way to sum up the Tate's offering.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to be, it wasn't a joke. It was actually closer to reality than we might. Health and safety, someone said to me they were not allowed to carve stone anymore because health and safety said they don't want the dust, or, so art schools become run by health and safety rather than by any sensible idea.
Yeah, I've been making notes like crazy because there's so much you're opening up for me tonight with this lecture. But I'm wondering if I'm the only one. I'm sure I'm not on this call, which I'm starting to think that actually all artists are drawn to the practice because they're touched in this way by this idea of the sublime, or they've been touched by the experience of sublimity.
Yeah, because it's beyond form. It's without boundary. It's also a decentering of the subject. It's the subject thrown into limit. So it's an emotion. So you could say if it's an emotion, it's something which happens to the subject. It's not necessarily something produced by the subject or replicated. The replication of the sublime is full of pitfalls because it's you producing an object where it's cited as a formless object which does something to the subject. It's the subject to the limit. So I'd say the sublime emotion is circulating, but the sublime in art is something which is being massacred.
Yeah.
As to the notion of sublime and the idea of discord sounds naturally quite, negative to me. Mm. What if we kept the idea that there is a form of transcendence in the sublime, but it doesn't have to be negative? So
the sublime is both the combination of discord of the imagination and the ascent of reason or the ascent of understanding. So it has got and this earlier etymology of sublime being a kind of movement from matter into a kind of vapor. So it's kind of mixed with states of dissolution and transformation and one state becoming another state. So it's closer to non-serious, so it's closer to a pulsation. It's a movement. It's a movement of the perceiving subject in relationship to the intended object. So it's not the starry abode or the hostile mountains, which is sublime. It's the emotion of the subject in relationship to that. So there's, in a way, it's to overcome also object-subject dualism. So it has a higher purpose, as it were.
And in that regards, could we therefore say that the state of sublimity is the state of witness of the divine or God?
I mean, it starts off as a counterpoint to technological dominance. It's a kind of fault line of dominance. It's a different route. It's a counter Enlightenment idea, I think. It's radical within Kant. It's not Protestant. It's not sober. It's a kind of, it's a fault line of reason. I mean, the aesthetic impulse start off as making account of what happens when reason finds a fault, where it becomes a judgment of taste, or there's something within art schools which is always countercultural, and it's to do with a suspicion of logic and instrumentality. The judgment of taste is aconceptual, so it's not a conceptual framework. Any more questions? Any more thoughts?
Well, yes, as I might repeat myself.
Go on, repeat yourself.
Because I'm still.
Repetition is the best didactic.
Because I'm still unsure on, well, it seems that, okay, so the sublime is born from discord, which can be our humanity, our weaknesses, so destruction we cause to others and within ourselves. But then from that discord, there's an elevation which is towards metaphysicals or religion or spirituality, is it not?
Sublime is the discord of the imagination, the descent of the imagination, and the ascent of reason.
Oh.
So it's two movements. There's always descent followed by, and displeasure followed by pleasure and ascent.
Yes, descent to ascension.
So it's descent and it's followed by ascent.
So ascent can be interpreted as metaphysicals or spirituality.
In Kant, it's more the moral idea.
Ah oui, for Kant, yeah.
So it depends who you read.
I'm insisting heavily, but trying to.
But you can have your transcendental flourish, if you like, with it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's more from a Kantian point of view.
Is a descent of imagination.
Yes.
An ascent of. So it's a super sensible.
Yes. Yes.
So the moral idea is super sensible. It's.
Okay, that speaks to me. That word super sensible speaks to me.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So imagination, it strains at limits. It can't understand magnitude or extent. It can't understand infinity. I used to, when I was very young, I used to sometimes, to put myself to sleep, I'd go into the night sky and extend my imagination forever. I had this image of forever and forever and forever, that space went on without limit. And if you go on forever and forever and forever, without boundary, without putting a stop to it, you go mad eventually, which is a good way of explaining how I finish up. Trying to deal with the forever and forever and forever of things. But the mind has to intersect at a certain point and say, stop it. You can't have, imagination just can't go on forever. It has to have a boundary, it has to have a limit, and that limit is the concept of the limitless. But the imagination doesn't stop. So you can say on a simple level is a discord of imagination and reason, whereas the beautiful is the fluttering of all faculties. It's not ascent or descent. It's the kind of fluttering, the suspension, a kind of free accord of the faculties, and it suspends the cognitive. It's the equal play between the sensory, the imaginative, and the cognitive. So that's the way that it finds delight in the beautiful.
Could we say that beauty and sublimity exist on the same spectrum and they're the same state, not quality projected onto an object, but a state? And you go from nothing to a state of beauty to eventually a state of sublimity.
There's not a progression from beautiful to the sublime. They're different categories. There's a different opposition. One is to do with objective form, and one's to do with the form of subjects. One's to do with static, one's to do with movement. One's to do with free play, and one's to do with discord. And Kant's quite clever. He divides them up. So you've got the mathematical and the dynamical, or the free beauty and dependent beauty. So in a way, Kant's both been incredibly influential, but also ignored. He's misread very easily.
But in a way, Jonathan, don't you think, well, maybe I'm being provocative here, but that Kant is a little bit ambiguous, and other people have jumped in, giving their own interpretations and pushing it in their predilections?
I mean, he's dealing with a very complex matter in his three critiques. He's trying to make a total critique of all existing knowledge into categories. But at least he acknowledged the difference between a judgment of taste and a judgment of reason. It was a great step within the subjective turn of philosophy. It's why Deleuze, he's both attracted towards Kant and repelled by Kant at the same time. Because part of Kant is also the way he predicates time and space as intuitions, they a priori. I'm not really advocating reading Kant or Kant as the main authority, but he did go furthest in his discourse on the sublime than any other philosopher. The essays to read in the modern period are by Jean-Luc Nancy. His Sublime Offering is a great essay, and Lyotard is interesting.
Thank you.
Any others?
Oh, well, yes.
Part 2, 3.
Does John Dewey in Art as Experience touch upon the sublime?
I don't know, I've not read John Dewey.
Okay, maybe anyone has? Okay, I'll let you know then.
I should, but I doubt I'll get round to it now. If I was 25, 30, I'd say, I'll read it tomorrow. But my tomorrow is approaching quickly, so I don't think I'll read it tomorrow.
I remember you mentioned that you were more interested in the idea of beauty than the sublime, and that today the sublime is present in the arts, whereas beauty has been overlooked, and that is bad.
Well, I said that beauty is a form of surprise. And there's still a surprise in beauty that's interesting. It's not beauty in itself that's interesting. It's the quality of surprise. One of the problems with the sublime, it's become too predictable. The way it's evoked.
But is it too predictable because artists aren't being clever enough, or we as human beings aren't being clever enough to reinvent it? So it's something totally unexpected and shocking and creating a rupture.
Yeah, I think it will resurface in a different way entirely, in a way which is not habitual.
Mm.
Or take us by surprise. Or the other lecture I want to do is on objection, which is in a way between object and subject. So there's a trilogy of lectures running through here: the beautiful, the sublime, and the abject. Said to be the ugly.
So sublime will be cyclical, with the same rupture and the same human discord over and over again, hence the lack of surprise.
It took on a sort of particularly in mass culture and particularly in film and music, it became a sort of ready-made shock and awe visual. It became visual. I think we'll have a textual sublime and a kind of relationship to subjects being able to occasion this feeling of sublimity, a sort of introspective sublime, if you like, not a
spectacle sublime.
Not a spectacle. That's the word I wanted. I think we've had enough spectacle. I mean, it was the music I was playing. I mean, it got drawn into also the spectacle of the Vietnam War and the war to end wars and the threat of nuclear annihilation and space travel and going to the cinema and dropping an E or a LSD to watch Space Odyssey or get out of it. So it's kind of like part of that ecstatic hipster culture of the time. I don't know how long. I mean, the music which was played was all late 60s. It's a long time ago. I wonder how it does it grate on present sensibility or not. I don't know.
Since the state of sublimity, well, is a state, we've talked about it from the perspective, I felt at least, of a spectator in front of a work of art. What could be said about the sublime and the act of making art?
Well, I'm skeptical about whether a work of art can be sublime. It can refer to a sublime experience, second order, on a second order, but it can't directly embody it in the way that the abstract sublime painters tried to embody a sublime feeling by making canvases big enough so that you couldn't take it all in at one time. Barnett Newman. But I think rather than seeing them as sublime paintings, I think they're beautiful paintings. I think he got it wrong. Not wrong, but I think it's so open to slippage. By giving a Latin name to it, doesn't necessarily make it sublime.
Word of caution for everyone.
Yeah.
But so if we're talking about a state, could that state just happen as we make art, just like it could happen as we witness art? Without
I think the more interesting proposition is that a kind of place where art's occurring, like an art school, there is a sort of emotion of the sublime, without necessarily a literalization of sublime works of art. I mean, they could be all sorts of disguises for the appearance of art, but the emotion that runs through them can be intense. So I think we're looking at something which is indirect and subtle and not necessarily full of pyrotechnics
And perhaps as well ephemeral.
Hmm?
Perhaps as well ephemeral.
Yeah,
Not lasting.
I mean, I can't. It's hard to work it out in one go. It's hard to, we need to do a series on sublime to really look at some texts and look at some artworks and really shake the subject a bit more. So it's just a starting point for the thoughts.
That lecture would have definitely challenged my perception of what the sublime was or is. I thought it was more hierarchical, like a hierarchy of beauty aspiring to the sublime. Whilst you're saying that actually, for you, it's more the sublime aspiring to beauty.
Often that the sublime gets conflated with beautiful. So it's an exceptional form of beauty. It's in popular culture. So the sublime pass in football, which hardly qualifies as sublimity, is routinely, oh, that's a sublime. It's like the reserve. It's like the image of the limit of language. Oh, that's a sublime pass. You don't need to say anything more. It erases description. It's a quality of wow. I mean, in a way, beauty is the wow state. It's a suspension. It's a single drawing of the breath in. Wow. Whereas sublimity is sort of an ascent and a descent and an ascent. It's two movements. It's got a kind of narrative to it, sublime.
So when tasting some delicious food, instead of saying this is sublime, we should say this is delicious. This is beautiful.
Yeah, beauty is closer to the truth of the matter. The misuse of language, isn't it, to say it's sublime? You're eating a meal and it's sublime. This food's sublime. It's a nonsense.
I wonder if it's used more in some languages and culture than others, like Italy and France, because the sublime, we do use it a lot. It's an enlightening moment, whether it's food or drink or wine or fun or sunset. We will say, yeah, it is sublime, and it's like, it's the best of the best. So perhaps it also has to do with a cultural...
It's elevation. It's just another set of words for elevation, but it's a kind of become a...
Yes.
And it's a ready-made. It becomes, you go to the Tate, to the installation, it's, oh, that's sublime. It's already a kind of ready-made you can't work it out either. You can't think it. You can't calculate what sublime is and what sublime isn't. So it happens more at the subject end of things, within the subject, and the limit of the subject, where the image, the subject cracks up and becomes other.
And it must vary so much from culture to culture, from one culture's experience of the world to another.
Well, we're talking about discourses which are European, mainly. And then we're talking about an emotion which is common to a lot of different cultures in a lot of different contexts. So there's a lot of cultures which don't have access to the word like sublime, but have different ways of understanding transformation.
And different triggers, I imagine, as well.
Yeah. So again, we would maybe seek out those different cultural moments or passages and think of what words are used in relationship to them. I thought in this lecture I just didn't have the it's 100 slides, and I thought Shiva Nataraja, Chola period, 10th, 11th century, is one of the greatest images of sublimity in the history of art. But they didn't have an aesthetic concept of the sublime. It's a beginning and ending of the world in a single image, the cosmic dance. It's the birth of time, and it's the end of time, dissolution of time.
Is that what we saw at the V&A the other day?
Saw it at the V&A.
Yeah.
Do you recall having an experience of a sublime state yourself?
No. I've had, to be honest, I've had out-of-body experiences where I've looked down on my own body doing something. That I wouldn't describe that as sublime.
Was that beautiful?
No, it's distressing.
Had you actively seeked that out, or was that something that happened to you?
It happened. It's extreme physiological distress.
But I mean, to answer to Leonardo's question, I think I've been on the edge of these experiences where you feel that danger, and you feel that it's almost like when you talk about this dropping and then this coming up, it's almost like, I haven't been on a zero gravity flight, but I imagine it's like when you go along and they drop the plane, and it's like the floor drops away from underneath you, and it's that moment where you catch your breath, and it's like that, the floor disappears, and I've definitely had those experiences, or touched close to those experiences before, and even I remember a childhood book of mine with an illustration of Alice in Wonderland where she's falling through the floor, but I just could never get my head around the visual of how the space was working, and I was always, every time I saw that image, it was sort of like, how is that working? How is that? And that sort of rupture to the story and the visual narrative that was coming along with it. And I could never quite work it out. So for me, this lecture tonight's touching on so many of those moments that I can think of in my life where I haven't been able to explain it. And it has been that rupture. It has been that kind of moment of like, something's given way to something else.
So yeah, there's a transformational element, but there is in beauty as well.
Yeah, that's true. but also there's that feeling of danger as well that you talk about as well, and being on the precipice of something that you're just so unsure of. Yeah.
I mean, we can say the whole culture is becoming sublime.
With the state of the world and the state of everything that's going on around us, you mean?
And it's out of that experience that I mean, there's an awful lot of trauma, you know, people reporting on an everyday level, trauma on different levels, but it's become a very common experience, whereas it kind of was hidden before, not hidden anymore. I mean, just in terms of everyday exposure, I just come across it all the time now. And sooner or later, someone has to do something with. I mean, it's material that's in process of being formed. There's no form for it, but forms will be found. So we're on the edge of another culture, and when you make a transition in cultural passage, it's like a tearing. So we've lost all the certainties of modern codes of narratives, of progress, of development, of freedom, and all that rhetoric that came with the modern. Seeing as believing, even. So now, don't believe our eyes, we don't believe our ears, we don't. So it's suffering from extreme weightlessness.
Agreed. So it's like the ground is sort of disappearing underneath us.
The ground is disappearing. That's why I evoked that, because you had a description for it.
Yeah.
I even wonder why, you know, last week we had a question answer time and no one spoke really. There's only one or two questions, and today been very lively. So I wonder why, you know, certain topics connect, animate or move or.
I wasn't there last week, unfortunately, but sublime is so, to me, was such an aspirational and poetic state to achieve. Tonight, I wanted to find out about, of course, what.
So I've depressed you. I've depressed you, have I?
No, I think no, because I think that your example, for instance, of the out of body experience, even though it wasn't a pleasurable one, and what Shawin just mentioned, it's the disruption and the discord is a state of transition, not necessarily the arrival.
Not arrival, it's the in-between.
The in-between is terribly scary. My God, I get, that is why I'm at. I get it. The trauma is the in-between, so it's vile. But there is, and it's funny because I don't go to church or anything like. I could, but I don't. I'm not like I keep on talking about spirituality, but spirituality is important to me, and it is a transformation state which is so painful, but which connects you more to who you are and perhaps to the world and to an authentic state, which then might make you act upon it to make it better in one way or the other for yourself or for the world. That sounds very blah, blah, blah. So that's why I thought that lecture was really interesting me. I love that word, sublime. I think it's very beautiful too. I like pronouncing.
I like to hear the sound of it. I only watch football to hear the word sublime once.
No, I go to an Italian restaurant or a French one. It's like, mwah, this is sublime.
So it's a suggestion.
It's Italian as well and French. It's like, mwah.
So beauty is wow.
Yes. It's natural too, yes.
We better close down. We've done 2 hours together.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic.
Yeah, it was really great tonight. Thank